The night air hung heavy with moisture as Sergeant John Basilone crouched in the mud, his eyes burning from 3 days without sleep. It was October 25, 1942, just before dawn, on the island of Guadalcanal. The relentless tropical rain had finally ceased, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the occasional moan of wounded men. As the first hints of gray light crept through the jungle canopy, Basilone surveyed the battlefield before him, his mind struggling to comprehend the scale of what had just transpired. Hundreds of Japanese bodies lay piled in grotesque heaps before his machine gun position, some stacked 5 deep, where they had fallen while charging the American lines. Private First Class Nash Phillips crawled toward Basilone, his own face etched with exhaustion and disbelief. "Sergeant," he whispered, "there must be 300 of them dead out there." Basilone simply nodded, his 1,000-yard stare fixed on the carnage. His hands were raw and blistered from the scorching barrels of his machine guns. His bare feet were caked in mud and blood, his uniform hung in tatters, yet somehow against impossible odds, he stood victorious. A single Marine with a machine gun and pistol had just annihilated an entire Japanese assault force. Phillips would later recall the moment with reverent awe. He was barefooted, and his eyes were red as fire. His face was dirty black from gunfire and lack of sleep. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his shoulders. He had a .45 tucked into the waistband of his trousers. What Phillips saw that morning defied 27 years of military doctrine and conventional wisdom. One man had stood against hundreds and prevailed. As Basilone surveyed the devastating results of his one-man stand, he knew that what happened here would forever change how Americans viewed their fighting capabilities against the seemingly unstoppable Japanese war machine. The journey that brought John Basilone to this pivotal moment began far from the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal. Born on November 4, 1916, in Buffalo, New York, he was the 6th of 10 children born to Italian immigrant parents. His father, Salvatore Basilone, had emigrated from Naples, Italy, in the early 1900s, seeking the American dream. The family later moved to Raritan, New Jersey, where young John grew up in a tight-knit Italian-American community. Like many children of immigrants during this era, Basilone developed a fierce patriotism for his country, alongside strong family values. The America that shaped Basilone was one emerging from the Great Depression, where economic hardship had forged a generation accustomed to sacrifice and hard work. After completing middle school, 15-year-old Basilone left formal education behind to work as a golf caddy at the local country club, contributing his earnings to help support his large family. This early exposure to responsibility would serve him well in the years to come. In 1934, at just 17 years old, Basilone enlisted in the United States Army. His first posting was with the 16th Infantry Regiment at Fort Jay, New York, but his hunger for adventure led him to re-enlist for assignment with the 31st Infantry Regiment in the Philippines. It was during this 3-year stint in Manila that he earned the nickname Manila John and developed a reputation as a formidable boxer. These years in the Philippines gave Basilone his first exposure to the Pacific region that would later become the stage for his legendary heroism. After his honorable discharge from the Army in 1939, Basilone worked briefly as a truck driver in Maryland. However, civilian life failed to provide the sense of purpose and camaraderie he had found in military service. On July 11, 1940, Basilone enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. The timing of his decision would prove fateful, as the gathering storm clouds of global conflict were about to unleash a war that would engulf the Pacific. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, America's entry into World War II dramatically altered the trajectory of Basilone's military career. By May 1942, he was a sergeant serving in the Pacific as American forces began their island-hopping campaign against the Japanese Empire. The strategic importance of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands made it a critical objective for both sides. Since May of that year, Japanese forces had been constructing an airfield on the island, which, if completed, would threaten Allied supply lines to Australia and New Zealand. On August 7, 1942, American forces launched their first major offensive operation of the Pacific War, landing on Guadalcanal and seizing the partially completed airfield. The Americans renamed it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at the Battle of Midway. The Japanese, however, were determined to recapture this vital installation, setting the stage for one of the most brutal and prolonged battles of the Pacific theater. By September 19th, Barcelona's unit Arleui, the 1st Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division Arleurés, had landed on Guadalcanal to reinforce the beleaguered American defenders. The conditions they encountered were abysmal. The island's dense jungle, stifling heat, torrential rains, and malarial mosquitoes created an environment nearly as deadly as the enemy. Marines frequently operated on limited rations as Japanese naval superiority in the region made resupply missions hazardous. Despite these challenges, the Marines were ordered to defend Henderson Field at all costs. The Japanese forces opposing the Americans were formidable adversaries. The Imperial Japanese Army was composed of highly disciplined soldiers, indoctrinated with Bushido, the warrior code that emphasized honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. Many Japanese soldiers had years of combat experience from Japan's war in China, and they had been trained to fight to the death rather than surrender. Their tactics included nighttime banzai charges, barulom, human wave attacks, accompanied by blood-curdling screams designed to break enemy morale. American propaganda had portrayed the Japanese as inferior fighters, arkasa, short in stature, poor in vision, and incapable of sophisticated military operations. This dangerous underestimation of the enemy had contributed to the disaster at Pearl Harbor and subsequent defeats in the Philippines. By October 1942, however, the Marines on Guadalcanal harbored no such illusions. They had witnessed firsthand the fanatical determination and combat proficiency of their Japanese opponents. The strategic situation on Guadalcanal grew increasingly dire in mid-October as Japanese forces received substantial reinforcements. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the Japanese 17th Army, assembled a force of 20,000 men for a major offensive against the American positions. Among these reinforcements was the Sendai Division, comprised of some of Japan's most experienced and battle-hardened troops. The Japanese plan called for a coordinated attack on multiple fronts, with the main thrust aimed directly at Henderson Field. If successful, this offensive would drive the Americans from the island and restore Japanese control of this strategic location. The date set for the attack was October 24, 1942. As dusk fell on that fateful day, Sergeant John Basilone and his machine gun sections occupied defensive positions along what was known as the Lunga Perimeter, Oskasherm, a thin line of American defenses protecting Henderson Field. Basilone commanded two sections of heavy machine guns, 30 caliber Browning M1917s, water-cooled weapons capable of delivering devastating firepower, but prone to jamming if not properly maintained. His position was near a narrow pass that would later be identified as a critical point in the defensive line. Rain began to fall as darkness enveloped the jungle, reducing visibility to near zero. The Marines huddled in their foxholes and gun emplacements, straining to detect any sign of enemy movement in the impenetrable blackness before them. The only illumination came from occasional flares that cast ghostly, fleeting shadows across the battlefield. At approximately 10 p.m., the night erupted in chaos as Japanese artillery and mortar fire rained down on the Marine positions. The thunderous bombardment was quickly followed by the chilling sound of thousands of voices screaming, "Banzai! Banzai!" as the first wave of attackers surged toward the American lines. The Sendai Division had launched its assault. The Marines responded with disciplined fire, their machine guns cutting down the charging Japanese soldiers. But the attackers kept coming, scrambling over the bodies of their fallen comrades in their determination to reach the American positions. The fighting was intense and often hand-to-hand, as Japanese troops who penetrated the defensive perimeter were engaged with pistols, rifles, bayonets, and even entrenching tools. Throughout this nightmarish battle, Sergeant John Basilone moved constantly among his men, directing their fire, repositioning guns, and maintaining a steady stream of encouragement. When one of his machine gun sections was knocked out of action by Japanese fire, Basilone immediately sprang into action. Grabbing a spare machine gun that weighed nearly 90 pounds, he fought his way through enemy fire to reach the disabled section. Upon arriving at the position, he found 2 Marines still alive, but unable to operate their weapon. Under intense enemy fire, Basilone set up his replacement gun and began firing into the advancing Japanese troops. The muzzle flashes from his weapon illuminated the determination etched on his face as he methodically cut down wave after wave of attackers. As the battle raged into the early morning hours of October 25th, Basilone's guns began to run dangerously low on ammunition. The supply lines had been cut by Japanese infiltrators, leaving the machine gunners isolated and vulnerable. Recognizing the dire situation, Basilone made an extraordinary decision. He would personally retrieve the needed ammunition. In what can only be described as a suicidal mission, Basilone left the relative safety of his position and fought his way through enemy lines. Armed only with a pistol and his wits, he navigated the chaotic battlefield, eliminating Japanese soldiers who stood in his path. Reaching the ammunition supply point, he gathered as many belts of .30 caliber ammunition as he could carry, and began the perilous journey back to his men. The weight of the ammunition, approximately 90 pounds, did not slow Basilone as he raced through enemy territory. Witnesses would later describe seeing him sprint across open ground under intense fire, somehow emerging unscathed despite the bullets kicking up dirt at his feet. Upon reaching his position, he distributed the precious ammunition and returned to the fight. As the battle continued, Basilone demonstrated not only his courage, but also his technical expertise. The water-cooled Browning machine guns were prone to overheating and jamming during prolonged fire. Without protective asbestos gloves, Basilone used his bare hands to adjust the scorching hot barrels, suffering severe burns in the process. Yet he ignored the pain, focusing solely on keeping his guns operational. At one point during the night, Japanese bodies had piled so high in front of Basilone's position that they blocked his field of fire. In an act of almost unbelievable bravery, he left his covered position and ventured into no man's land to clear the obstructions. Under enemy fire and in near total darkness, he pushed aside the bodies of the fallen Japanese to restore his gun's effectiveness. The fighting continued unabated throughout the night, with Japanese forces launching repeated assaults against the Marine positions. Each time, Basilone and his men repelled them, though at terrible cost. By the early hours of October 25th, most of Basilone's machine gun crews had been killed or wounded. At one point, he personally operated 3 machine guns simultaneously, moving between them to maintain a continuous field of fire. As dawn approached on October 25th, Japanese commanders made a final, desperate attempt to break through the American lines. Gathering their remaining forces, they launched one last banzai charge directly at Basilone's position. By this time, his machine guns had exhausted their ammunition. Faced with an overwhelming enemy force and no heavy weapons, Basilone drew his .45 caliber pistol and unsheathed his machete. In the dim pre-dawn light, he stood his ground as the Japanese attackers closed in. With deadly accuracy, he fired his pistol until the ammunition was expended, then engaged in hand-to-hand combat with his machete. Marine reinforcements arrived just as Basilone was facing the last of the attackers, finding him standing amidst dozens of enemy dead, exhausted but unbowed. As the sun rose over Guadalcanal on the morning of October 25, 1942, the full extent of the battle became visible. The ground in front of the Marine positions was carpeted with Japanese bodies, faria, the remnants of an entire regiment, virtually annihilated in their attempt to break through. Military historians would later confirm that at least 38 Japanese soldiers had been killed personally by Basilone during the engagement. The significance of the victory cannot be overstated. The Japanese offensive had been decisively defeated, and Henderson Field remained in American hands. Had the Japanese succeeded in recapturing the airfield, the entire Guadalcanal campaign might have ended in disaster for Allied forces. Instead, the successful defense marked a turning point in the Pacific War, the moment when the seemingly invincible Japanese advance was finally halted. The cost, however, had been high. Many Marines had given their lives in the defense of the perimeter, and most of Basilone's machine gun crews had been killed or wounded. The survivors were exhausted beyond measure, having fought continuously for over 30 hours without rest, food, or adequate water. The official citation would read, "For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action against enemy Japanese forces, above and beyond the call of duty, while serving with the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, 1st Marine Division in the Lunga area, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, on 24th and 25th October, 1942. The citation continued. While the enemy was hammering at the Marines' defensive positions, Sergeant Basilone, in charge of 2 sections of heavy machine guns, fought valiantly to check the savage and determined assault. News of Basilone's extraordinary heroism quickly spread throughout the Marine Corps. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, himself a legendary Marine, recommended him for the nation's highest military honor. In a fierce frontal attack with the Japanese blasting his guns with grenades and mortar fire, one of Sergeant Basilone's sections, with its gun crews, was put out of action, leaving only 2 men able to carry on. Moving an extra gun into position, he placed it in action, then, under continual fire, repaired another and personally manned it, gallantly holding his line until replacements arrived. The most remarkable part of the citation described his ammunition run. A little later, with ammunition critically low and the supply lines cut off, Sergeant Basilone, at great risk of his life and in the face of continued enemy attack, battled his way through hostile lines with urgently needed shells for his gunners, thereby contributing in large measure to the virtual annihilation of a Japanese regiment. For his actions on those 2 fateful days, John Basilone would become the first enlisted Marine in World War II to receive the Medal of Honor. But in the immediate aftermath of the battle, such recognition was far from his mind. When a fellow Marine commented on his extraordinary performance, Basilone reportedly shrugged and said, "I was just doing my job." The psychological impact of Basilone's stand against the Japanese forces extended far beyond the tactical victory achieved on Guadalcanal. For American troops throughout the Pacific, the story of one Marine sergeant who had successfully held off a regiment of Japan's elite Sendai Division challenged the prevailing narrative of Japanese invincibility. Since the attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent fall of the Philippines, American forces had suffered a series of demoralizing defeats at the hands of Japanese forces. The Japanese soldier had been mythologized as a superhuman warrior, fanatically dedicated, impervious to hardship, and tactically superior to his American counterpart. This perception had created a dangerous psychological advantage for Japanese forces. Basilone's actions shattered this myth. Here was tangible proof that American fighting men, when properly led and motivated, could not only stand against the best Japanese troops, but could decisively defeat them. The psychological boost this provided to American morale throughout the Pacific theater was incalculable. For the Japanese, the failure to recapture Henderson Field marked a devastating reversal of fortunes. The Imperial Japanese Army had rarely experienced defeat prior to Guadalcanal, having conquered vast territories across Asia with relative ease. The realization that their elite Sendai Division had been stopped primarily by the heroic actions of a single American Marine, represented a shocking challenge to their sense of martial superiority. Japanese commanders were forced to reassess their tactics and their estimation of American fighting capabilities. No longer could they assume that banzai charges and sheer determination would overcome American firepower and resolve. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been permanently damaged, and with it, a crucial psychological advantage in the Pacific conflict. In the weeks following the battle, as American forces consolidated their hold on Guadalcanal, detailed intelligence reports revealed the true scale of the Japanese defeat. The Sendai Division, once considered among Japan's finest fighting units, had been virtually destroyed as an effective combat force. Nearly 3,000 of its men had been killed in the failed offensive, with hundreds more wounded or missing. American casualties, while significant, had been far lighter Abu Sulao, a testament to the effectiveness of the defensive positions and the extraordinary performance of Marines like Basilone. The disparity in losses dealt a severe blow to Japanese strategic calculations, forcing Tokyo to reconsider its entire approach to the Pacific campaign. Perhaps most significantly, the successful defense of Henderson Field represented the first major American ground victory against Japanese forces in World War II. After months of retreats and defeats, American troops had finally held their ground and repulsed a major Japanese offensive. The psychological impact of this achievement resonated throughout the Allied command structure and fundamentally altered strategic planning for future operations. For the Marines who had witnessed Basilone's heroism firsthand, the experience left an indelible impression. Private First Class Nash Phillips, who had fought alongside Basilone during those harrowing hours, would later provide one of the most vivid testimonials to his sergeant's extraordinary actions. Basilone had a machine gun on the go for 3 days and nights without sleep, rest, or food, Phillips recalled. He was in a good emplacement and causing the Japanese lots of trouble, not only firing his machine gun, but also using his pistol. Phillips, who lost a hand in the fighting, remembered Basilone visiting him shortly after dawn on October 25th. He was barefooted and his eyes were red as fire. His face was dirty black from gunfire and lack of sleep. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his shoulders. He had a .45 tucked into the waistband of his trousers. Other survivors described equally remarkable scenes. One Marine recalled seeing Basilone sprint across open ground under intense enemy fire to retrieve ammunition, describing it as the bravest thing I've ever seen. Another remembered how Basilone had continued to operate his machine gun despite severe burns to his hands from the overheated barrel, never once complaining about the pain or slackening in his resolve. These first-hand accounts, shared among Marine units throughout the Pacific, contributed to the growing legend of Manila John Basilone. He became a symbol of Marine Corps tenacity and fighting spirit race, living proof that one determined Marine could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The full extent of Basilone's physical ordeal during those 30-plus hours of continuous combat was staggering. Operating heavy machine guns for extended periods without relief had taken a severe toll on his body. The water-cooled Browning M1917s weighed approximately 40 pounds each, and Basilone had been constantly moving these weapons to different firing positions throughout the battle. His hands were severely burned from handling the hot barrels and mechanisms without protective gloves. His feet were lacerated and bloody from running barefoot across the rough terrain. Sleep deprivation had pushed him to the limits of human endurance, yet he had remained focused and effective throughout the ordeal. Medical personnel who examined Basilone after the battle were amazed at his condition. Beyond the visible injuries to his hands and feet, he showed signs of extreme physical exhaustion. He had lost significant weight due to the lack of food during the prolonged engagement. His voice was hoarse from shouting commands over the din of battle. Yet, despite these challenges, he had never wavered in his determination to hold his position. The physical courage demonstrated by Basilone was matched by his tactical acumen. Throughout the chaotic nighttime battle, he had made numerous critical decisions that maximized the effectiveness of his limited resources. His decision to personally retrieve ammunition when supplies ran low showed both personal bravery and a clear understanding of the tactical situation. His constant repositioning of his machine guns to counter Japanese movements revealed an instinctive grasp of battlefield dynamics. Most impressive was his ability to maintain command and control under extreme duress. Despite the noise, confusion, and darkness, Barcelone had continued to direct his remaining men effectively, ensuring that their fire was concentrated where it would have the greatest impact. This combination of physical courage, tactical intelligence, and leadership ability set Barcelone apart, even among the many heroes of Guadalcanal. As news of Barcelone's extraordinary actions reached the American homeland, he was quickly recognized as the face of American resistance in the Pacific. In May 1943, he was formally presented with the Medal of Honor, and on June 1st, he was promoted to platoon sergeant. The Marine Corps, recognizing his value as a symbol of American fighting spirit, ordered him back to the United States to participate in war bond tours. Barcelone's return to America triggered an outpouring of public adulation. His hometown of Raritan, New Jersey, organized a parade in his honor that drew 15,000 spectators, more than 3 times the town's population. Life magazine featured him prominently, and newsreels celebrated his exploits. As he toured the country promoting war bonds, thousands turned out to catch a glimpse of the hero of Guadalcanal. The public's reception of Barcelone revealed much about the American psyche in the midst of World War II. After the shock of Pearl Harbor and the subsequent string of defeats in the Pacific, Americans desperately needed heroes, tangible symbols of resistance against the Axis powers. Barcelone, with his humble background, immigrant parents, and extraordinary bravery, perfectly embodied the American ideal of the common man rising to uncommon heights in defense of his country. Yet, amid this adulation, something remarkable happened. Unlike many who might have been seduced by fame and comfortable stateside assignments, Barcelone began to chafe at his role as a celebrity. He felt uncomfortable being praised for actions he considered simply part of his duty. More importantly, he felt that his place was with his fellow Marines in the Pacific, continuing the fight against Japan. In a decision that would ultimately cost him his life but cement his legacy, Barcelone repeatedly requested to be returned to combat duty. The Marine Corps, understandably reluctant to risk such a valuable propaganda asset, initially refused. They offered him a commission as an officer and a permanent stateside assignment, both of which he declined. "I'm just a plain soldier," Barcelone insisted, "and I want to stay one. I ain't no officer and I ain't no museum piece. I belong back with my outfit." His persistence eventually paid off. In December 1943, Barcelone's request was approved, and he was assigned to Camp Pendleton, California, to train for the next major offensive in the Pacific. While at Camp Pendleton, Barcelone met Sergeant Lena Mae Riggy, a fellow Marine serving in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. The two quickly fell in love and were married in July 1944 at St. Mary's Star of the Sea Church in Oceanside, California. Their happiness would be brief. In December 1944, Barcelone shipped out to the Pacific with the 1st Battalion, 27th Marines, 5th Marine Division. On February 19, 1945, just 7 months after his wedding, Gunnery Sergeant John Barcelone landed with the first waves on the black volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima. Once again demonstrating extraordinary courage, he single-handedly destroyed a Japanese blockhouse and guided a Marine tank through a minefield under heavy enemy fire. As he moved along the edge of an airfield, he was struck by Japanese mortar fire and killed instantly. For his actions on Iwo Jima, Barcelone was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, becoming the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. His sacrifice on that distant island provided final confirmation of the quality he had first displayed on Guadalcanal. an unwavering commitment to duty regardless of personal cost. The legacy of John Basillone's stand on Guadalcanal extended far beyond his personal heroism. It represented a pivotal moment in the Pacific War, Frausturis, the point at which American forces demonstrated they could not only resist Japanese attacks, but could decisively defeat them. The psychological impact of this victory reverberated throughout both American and Japanese forces, fundamentally altering the dynamics of the conflict. For American military planners, the successful defense of Henderson Field provided valuable insights into Japanese tactics and vulnerabilities. The effectiveness of well-positioned machine guns against banzai charges informed defensive doctrines that would be employed throughout subsequent Pacific campaigns. The importance of individual initiative and leadership in critical moments, as exemplified by Basillone, became a cornerstone of Marine Corps training and culture. Japanese commanders, confronted with the failure of tactics that had previously brought them success, were forced to reassess their approach to engaging American forces. The myth of American inferiority as fighting men had been shattered, requiring a fundamental recalibration of Japanese strategy. This psychological shift would influence Japanese decision-making throughout the remainder of the war. Perhaps most significantly, Basillone's actions contributed to a broader transformation in how Americans perceived the Pacific War. Prior to Guadalcanal, many Americans had viewed Japan as an unstoppable juggernaut, a perception reinforced by repeated Allied defeats. Basillone's heroic stand helped change this narrative, offering tangible proof that the tide could be turned. In the decades following World War II, John Basillone's legacy continued to grow. The United States Navy commissioned the destroyer USS Basillone, DD-824, in his honor in 1949. His hometown of Raritan, New Jersey, erected a statue commemorating his heroism and hosts an annual parade in his memory, a tradition that continues to this day, more than 75 years after his death. Basillone's story has been featured in books, documentaries, and most notably in the HBO miniseries The Pacific, which introduced his extraordinary courage to a new generation. Marine Corps training facilities bear his name, and his example continues to inspire young Marines embarking on their military careers. Yet perhaps the most significant aspect of Basillone's legacy lies not in these formal recognitions, but in the fundamental change his actions helped bring about in American confidence and resolve. At a critical moment when the outcome of the Pacific War hung in the balance, one Marine sergeant demonstrated that courage, determination, and skill could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The transformation in American military psychology following Basillone's stand was profound and lasting. The defeatism that had characterized the early months of the Pacific War gave way to a growing confidence in American fighting capabilities. Marines and soldiers throughout the Pacific theater drew inspiration from the knowledge that one of their own had stood against an elite Japanese regiment and emerged victorious. This psychological shift extended beyond military circles to impact the American home front as well. Basillone's story, widely publicized through news reports and war bond tours, provided civilian Americans with tangible evidence that the war in the Pacific could be won. This boosted morale and increased support for the war effort at a critical juncture. For the Japanese military, the implications were equally significant but far more troubling. The failure to capture Henderson Field, despite committing some of their best troops to the effort, forced a painful reassessment of their strategic position. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Japanese forces since their early conquests had been permanently damaged. Intelligence reports captured after the war revealed that Japanese commanders were particularly disturbed by accounts of Basillone's one-man stand. It contradicted their fundamental belief in the superior fighting spirit of Japanese soldiers and suggested that American troops possessed a level of determination and combat effectiveness that had been severely underestimated. This cognitive dissonance subverted The gap between expected outcomes and reality created a crisis in Japanese military thinking. If their elite Sendai division could be defeated primarily through the efforts of one particularly determined Marine sergeant, what did this suggest about their chances in future engagements against the full might of American forces? The answer to this question would unfold over the subsequent years of the Pacific War, as American forces advanced inexorably toward the Japanese homeland. The strategic initiative lost at Guadalcanal would never be fully regained by Japanese forces, and the psychological advantage they had enjoyed in the early stages of the conflict had been irreparably damaged. John Basilon's extraordinary actions during those 2 days in October 1942 thus represent far more than an isolated act of heroism. They mark a crucial inflection point in the Pacific War era, the moment when the narrative of Japanese invincibility was conclusively shattered and replaced by a new understanding of American fighting capabilities. In this sense, Basilon's stand embodies the broader story of America's recovery from the shock of Pearl Harbor and subsequent defeats to emerge as the dominant military power in the Pacific. Like the nation he served, Basilone faced overwhelming odds with determination and courage, ultimately prevailing through a combination of skill, leadership, and indomitable will. The transformation in American confidence following Basilone's heroic stand manifested in numerous tangible ways. Marine Corps recruitment surged as young Americans, inspired by accounts of Basilone's courage, volunteered to join the service. Production of war materials increased as civilian workers, energized by stories of frontline heroism, redoubled their efforts in factories and shipyards. War bond sales rose dramatically during Basilone's promotional tour, providing crucial funding for the expanding American war machine. Within military circles, Basilone's example influenced training doctrines and tactical approaches. The Marine Corps placed increased emphasis on small unit leadership and individual initiative, recognizing that in the chaotic environment of Pacific Island fighting, the actions of individual Marines often determined the outcome of engagements. Machine gun crews received enhanced training, inspired by Basilone's demonstration of how effectively these weapons could be employed against mass infantry attacks. For the Japanese military, the psychological impact was equally profound but destructive to their war effort. The failure to capture Henderson Field, despite committing elite troops to the battle, created a crisis of confidence within the Japanese high command. Reports of Basilone's one-man stand against their best soldiers undermined fundamental assumptions about Japanese martial superiority. Intelligence documents captured after the war revealed that Japanese commanders had been particularly disturbed by American accounts of the battle. One Japanese staff officer wrote in his diary, "How could one American sergeant destroy an entire company of our soldiers? Either their reports exaggerate or we have gravely underestimated our enemy." This questioning of basic assumptions represented a significant crack in the edifice of Japanese military thinking. The strategic implications of the successful defense of Henderson Field extended far beyond Guadalcanal itself. By maintaining control of the airfield, American forces secured a vital forward base from which to project power throughout the Solomon Islands. More importantly, the victory marked the furthest extent of Japanese expansion in the Pacific and the beginning of the long, bloody campaign to push them back to their home islands. For individual Marines who fought alongside Basilone, the experience transformed their understanding of what was possible in combat. Private Robert Leckie, who served on Guadalcanal, though not directly with Basilone, later wrote, "After we heard what Basilone had done, something changed in all of us. If one Marine could stop hundreds of Japanese, what could a company of Marines accomplish? What could a division do?" This newfound confidence would carry many of these men through subsequent battles across the Pacific. The legacy of John Basilone's heroism continues to resonate within American military culture. At Marine Corps recruit training depots in Parris Island and San Diego, drill instructors share his story with new generations of Marines, using his example to illustrate the Corps' core values of honor, courage, and commitment. The Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone Award is presented annually to a non-commissioned officer who demonstrates extraordinary leadership and technical proficiency, qualities that defined Basilone's service. Beyond formal recognitions, Basilone's influence persists in the cultural memory of the Marine Corps and the nation he served. His willingness to reject fame and comfort in favor of returning to combat duty with his fellow Marines embodies an ethos of selfless service that remains a cornerstone of military identity. His technical mastery of his weapons and tactical acumen under extreme pressure set a standard for professional excellence that continues to inspire. Perhaps most powerfully, Basilone's story serves as a reminder that in the most desperate circumstances, the actions of a single determined individual can alter the course of history. On those rain-soaked nights of October 24th and 25th, 1942, one Marine sergeant stood against the tide of Japanese expansion in the Pacific and held firm. In doing so, he not only saved Henderson Field but helped change the psychological dynamics of the entire Pacific War. As dawn broke over Guadalcanal on October 25th, 1942, few could have predicted the far-reaching consequences of what had just transpired. A sergeant from New Jersey, standing amid the carnage of battle, had demonstrated that the seemingly invincible Japanese war machine could be stopped. The myth of Japanese invincibility lay shattered among the hundreds of bodies strewn before his position. In that moment of exhaustion and triumph, John Basilone could not have known that his actions would earn him his nation's highest military honor. He could not have foreseen that he would become a national hero, or that he would ultimately give his life on another distant Pacific island. He knew only that he had done his duty, that he and his men had held their ground against overwhelming odds, and that Henderson Field remained in American hands. As history would prove, that was enough. The stand made by Basilone and his fellow Marines on those crucial October days represented a turning point in the Pacific War, the moment when American forces demonstrated they could not only resist Japanese attacks but decisively defeat them. From this victory would flow a growing confidence that would carry American forces across the Pacific, from island to island, until final victory was achieved. The legacy of John Basilone endures not just in official recognitions and commemorations, but in the fundamental truth his actions revealed, that courage, determination, and skill can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. In the darkest hours of the Pacific War, one Marine showed what was possible, and in doing so, helped change the course of history. In a final irony that Basilone would likely have appreciated, the nation he defended against Japanese aggression would, in time, become one of Japan's closest allies. The transformation of bitter enemies into partners in peace and prosperity stands as perhaps the most profound legacy of the sacrifice made by Basilone and countless other Americans and Japanese during those terrible years of conflict. Today, more than 80 years after that fateful battle on Guadalcanal, the name John Basilone continues to evoke admiration and respect. His story reminds us that history often hinges on the courage and determination of individuals willing to stand firm in moments of crisis. One Marine, one machine gun, one unwavering commitment to duty, sometimes, that is all that stands between defeat and victory.